Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. It was a peaceful morning on Jack Reynolds' farm. The sun had just risen, casting a golden hue over the rolling fields. Jack moved with the ease of a man who had lived on this land his entire life, tending to his crops and feeding his chickens. The rhythmic clucking of the hens and the occasional moo from a distant cow were the only sounds in the air until the tranquility was shattered by the roar of a luxury SUV speeding down his dirt driveway. Jack paused, wiping the sweat from his brow as the SUV screeched to a halt. The door flew open, and out stepped Karen Whitmore, the infamous president of the nearby HOA. Dressed in a designer blouse and oversized sunglasses, she marched toward Jack with the confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around her. In her hand was a stack of papers, which she waved around like they were sacred texts. "You," she barked, pointing an accusing finger at Jack. "You're the reason our property values are plummeting." Jack blinked, genuinely confused. "Good morning to you, too," he said with a slight smirk. "And who exactly are you?" "Karen Whitmore," she declared proudly, as if that alone explained everything. "President of the Willow Creek HOA. Your so-called farm is ruining our community's aesthetics." Jack chuckled, leaning on his pitchfork. "Lady, I'm not part of your HOA. This farm has been here for generations, long before your cookie-cutter houses popped up." Karen's face flushed with indignation. "Whether you're officially part of the HOA or not is irrelevant. Your unsightly barn, noisy animals, and that stench are unacceptable. Our community has standards, and you're violating every single one." Jack crossed his arms, unimpressed. "Look, I appreciate your concern, but this is my land. I've got no obligation to follow your HOA's rules." Karen narrowed her eyes, her tone turning icy. "Oh, you'll regret saying that. I'll make sure you comply one way or another." Jack rolled his eyes and turned back to his work, assuming that was the end of it. But he should have known better. Karen wasn't one to walk away without getting the last word, or in this case, without escalating things to a whole new level. "You leave me no choice," Karen hissed, reaching into her purse. Jack's eyes widened as she pulled out a small handgun, pointing it at him with shaky hands. "You're kidding, right?" Jack said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Over a farm? Come on, lady. This is a bit much even for an HOA president." "I'm serious," Karen yelled. "I'm tired of you and your filthy farm ruining our neighborhood. Either you pack up and leave, or I'll make sure you regret it." Jack's heart raced, but he kept his cool. Years of working the land had taught him how to stay calm in tense situations. All right. No need for that," he said, trying to buy time. "How about we talk this through like civilized people?" Karen's grip on the gun tightened. "No more talking. You're leaving today, one way or another." The situation was spiraling out of control fast. Starting to regret not installing a gate at the end of his driveway, he was about to say something else to de-escalate the situation when the distant wail of sirens caught both of their attention. A sheriff's car came into view, kicking up dust as it pulled up next to the SUV. Sheriff Daniel stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "Ma'am, drop the weapon," he commanded, his voice calm but firm. Karen froze, her bravado crumbling in an instant. "But I was protecting the community," she stammered. "You're the one who's out of control." The sheriff wasn't buying it. "Drop it now." Reluctantly, Karen lowered the gun and set on the ground. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Sheriff Daniels walked over and picked up the weapon, shaking his head in disbelief. "Karen Whitmore, you're under arrest for trespassing and brandishing a weapon," the sheriff said, snapping handcuffs onto her wrists. "You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt you'll use it." Jack couldn't help but grin as he watched Karen's indignant expression. "Looks like the law is not on your side today, Karen." Karen glared at him as the sheriff led her toward the car. "This isn't over," she shouted over her shoulder. "I'll be back, and next time you won't be so lucky." The sheriff chuckled as he opened the car door. "Oh, I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again real soon, Karen." As the sheriff's car disappeared down the road, Jack stood in the middle of his field, shaking his head in disbelief. He had dealt with difficult neighbors before, but this was a new level of crazy. He picked up his pitchfork and got back to work, figuring it was just another wild story to tell at the next town gathering. But deep down, Jack knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the kind of person to give up easily, and if her parting words were anything to go by, this was just the beginning of a long and messy battle. Later that afternoon, Jack sat on his porch, sipping sweet tea and chuckling about the morning's bizarre events. He figured Karen would get a hefty fine and learn her lesson. After all, pointing a gun at someone wasn't exactly how most folks resolve neighborhood disputes. But Jack underestimated the tenacity and sheer pettiness of Karen Whitmore. Her war was far from over. She wasn't just licking her wounds, she was plotting her next move. The very next day, Jack's peace was shattered again when a courier dropped off a large envelope stuffed with legal papers. As he tore it open and skimmed the contents, his jaw dropped. The HOA, led by none other than Karen, had filed a lawsuit against him. The accusation? That his farm was an unlawful nuisance and a blight on the community. The HOA was demanding that he either tear down half his farm structures or face hefty daily fines. Jack rubbed his forehead and muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." He wasn't even in the HOA. How could they sue him? He called his lawyer, Samantha Green, a non-nonsense attorney known for dismantling. When Jack explained the situation, Samantha laughed, a sharp, almost predatory sound that made Jack feel a bit better. "Oh, Jack," she said, "this is going to be fun. You've got nothing to worry about. They don't have a leg to stand on." 2 days later, the courtroom was packed. Word of the confrontation had spread, and curious locals filled the seats, eager to watch the drama unfold. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by her HOA cronies, all wearing smug expressions. She had clearly convinced them that Jack was an enemy of the community who needed to be taken down. Jack sat beside Samantha, calm but determined. He had nothing to hide, and he trusted Samantha to handle things. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, Samantha wasted no time going on the offensive. "Your Honor," Samantha began, standing tall and confident, "this case is ridiculous. My client, Jack Reynolds, owns private property that's not part of the HOA. The plaintiff has no jurisdiction over his land. This is nothing more than a personal vendetta wrapped in legal jargon." Karen's lawyer, a nervous-looking man who seemed more comfortable with wills than courtroom battles, stumbled through his opening statement. He tried to argue that Jack's farm was an eyesore that affected property values, but Samantha cut him down at every turn. When Karen took the stand, her confidence returned. She described Jack's farm in the most dramatic terms possible. According to her, it wasn't just a farm. It was a dystopian wasteland that threatened to ruin the entire neighborhood. She painted a picture of vile odors, dangerous livestock, and an endless stream of noisy machinery disturbing the peace. Jack couldn't help but chuckle softly as she went on. It was a far cry from reality. He glanced at the judge, who looked unimpressed. Samantha smiled as she stood to cross-examine Mrs. Whitmore. She said sweetly, "How long have you lived next to Jack?" 2 years, Karen replied confidently. "And in those 2 years, have you ever filed a legitimate complaint with any environmental or health authorities?" Karen paused, her confidence wavering. "Well, no, but that doesn't mean—" Samantha cut her off. "So in 2 years, despite all this supposed chaos, you never once thought to contact an actual authority? Instead, you decided to point a gun at my client and then sue him?" The courtroom burst into murmurs. Karen's face turned bright red. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," Karen stammered. Samantha leaned in. "Protect it from what?" "Fresh eggs and vegetables." The judge suppressed a chuckle. "Let's stay focused," he said, though his amusement was clear. Karen's lawyer tried to recover, suggesting that the HOA had a legitimate case because of an obscure zoning law. Karen smirked as if she had just played her trump card. Samantha, however, was ready. "Ah, the zoning law," Samantha said. "Your Honor, we've already reviewed that. It applies to commercial properties within HOA jurisdiction. Jack's farm is neither." Karen's smirk vanished in the courtroom. Murmurs grew louder as Samantha pressed on, presenting deeds, zoning maps, and legal precedents that thoroughly dismantled the H's case. The judge called for a recess, but it was clear where things were heading. Jack could feel the tide turning in his favor. During the break, several locals approached him, offering words of support. Apparently, Karen's antics had rubbed more than a few people the wrong way. When the court resumed, Karen made one last desperate attempt to win. She claimed she had a secret loophole that would force Jack to sell his land. The tension in the room spiked as Karen dramatically held up an ancient town record she'd uncovered. Samantha took one glance at it and grinned. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "this record is from 1912 and refers to an old water rights dispute that has no bearing on modern zoning laws." Karen's face fell. She had put all her hopes into that one last card, and it had been shot down in seconds. The judge leaned forward, tapping his gavel once. "I've heard enough. It's clear that the plaintiff's case is baseless. Mr. Reynolds is not part of the HOA and is under no obligation to follow its rules. Furthermore, the harassment he's endured is unacceptable." He turned to Karen. "Mrs. Whitmore, I strongly suggest you refrain from further actions against Mr. Reynolds, or you may find yourself facing serious legal consequences." Jack let out a sigh of relief as the judge dismissed the case. Samantha patted his shoulder. "Told you it'd be fun." Karen, on the other hand, was furious. She stormed out of the courtroom, muttering about how she'd get him next time. Jack couldn't help but laugh. "Guess I'll see her again soon," he said. Samantha grinned. "Let her try. We'll be ready." But deep down, Jack knew Karen wasn't done. This was just a legal skirmish in what was shaping up to be a long and ridiculous war. He might have won today, but with Karen involved, anything was possible. As he walked out of the courthouse, he made a mental note to check his security cameras and maybe reinforce his fences, just in case. The legal victory gave Jack a sense of relief, but it didn't last long. He had underestimated just how far Karen and her HOA cronies were willing to go. If they couldn't beat him in court, they were determined to make his life a living hell through less official means. It started small. A random health inspector showed up on Jack's farm one morning, clipboard in hand and a sour look on his face. Anonymous complaints, the inspector explained, listing off several alleged violations. According to the complaint, Jack's farm was a health hazard, his animals were not properly contained, and his water supply was contaminated. Jack knew right away who was behind it. Karen had recruited her network of nosy neighbors to flood local agencies with bogus complaints. While the inspector was thorough, he quickly realized that the claims were ridiculous. "Everything looks fine to me," the inspector said. Spector said, handing Jack a clean report, "But keep an eye out. Looks like someone's got a grudge." Jack sighed. He had hoped that the courtroom showdown would have put an end to things, but it seemed Karen was just getting started. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of sabotage and harassment. Someone slashed his irrigation lines in the middle of the night, leaving his crops parched and wilting. His fences were mysteriously cut in several places, allowing his cows to wander off into the nearby fields. Jack spent hours repairing the damage, cursing under his breath with every swing of his hammer. Then came the parade of HOA members, all trying their best to intimidate him. Every day, a different HOA board member would show up at his property line, snapping photos and jotting down notes as if they were building a case against him. Jack ignored them at first, but it became harder as their antics grew bolder. One afternoon, Jack caught one of them, an older man with a bad comb-over and a clipboard, leaning over his fence, snapping pictures of his barn. Jack calmly walked over and leaned against the fence. "Can I help you with something? Or do you just like taking pictures of other people's property?" The man jumped, nearly dropping his phone. I'm just documenting evidence for the HOA," he stammered. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Evidence of what?" "That my barn exists." The man muttered something about property values and scurried off, but it was clear they weren't going to stop. Realizing he couldn't fight them alone, Jack decided it was time to bring out the big guns, figuratively speaking, of course. He installed a network of security cameras around his property and set up motion-activated lights. If Karen and her gang want to play dirty, he was going to catch them in the act. It didn't take long for the cameras to pay off. Late one night, Jack was reviewing the footage when he saw a shadowy figure sneaking along his fence line. The figure bent down and started cutting the wire on his irrigation system. Jack recognized the person immediately. It was one of Karen's close friends, Greg, who had been at every HOA meeting since the legal battle began. Jack grinned. Gotcha. The next morning, he called Sheriff Daniels and handed over the footage. Looks like our friends in the HOA are a little more hands-on than they should be, Jack said, crossing his arms. The sheriff shook his head. These people never learn, do they? He promised to handle it, and later that day, Greg was arrested for vandalism. Word of Greg's arrest spread fast, and for the first time, the tide seemed to turn in Jack's favor. Locals who had once viewed the feud as petty began to see the truth. Jack was being harassed by a group of power-hungry busybodies who had gone too far. Support poured in from neighbors, local farmers, and even a few small business owners in town. People started showing up at Jack's farm with offers to help repair his fences and irrigation system. Some brought baked goods, others brought tools, but all of them brought the same message: we've got your back. The next time Karen and her HOA crew tried to intimidate Jack, they found themselves face to face with a small army of townspeople. Karen, used to getting her way with nothing more than a glare and a snide remark, was visibly shaken. She tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear that the tables had turned. Jack, standing in the middle of his field with a dozen neighbors by his side, gave her a polite wave. Morning, Karen. Here to check on my property values again. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. This isn't over, she snapped, spinning on her heel and marching back to her SUV. You'll regret this, Jack chuckled. I'm sure I will. But Karen wasn't ready to back down just yet. Desperate and running out of options, she decided to make one final push to get rid of Jack for good. She called an emergency HOA meeting, rallying her supporters and promising them that she had a surefire way to force Jack out once and for all. Her plan was to dig up an old, obscure zoning ordinance that she believed would give the HOA the power to declare Jack's farm a public nuisance. If the ordinance worked, it could force Jack to shut down his entire operation. What Karen didn't realize was that Samantha had already anticipated this move. As Karen proudly presented her findings at the next court hearing, Samantha waited patiently, letting her dig herself deeper and deeper. Then, with a smile that could freeze lava, Samantha stood and calmly dismantled Karen's argument in a matter of minutes. Your Honor, Samantha said, this ordinance applies only to properties within city limits. Jack's farm is on county land. The HOA has no authority here. Karen's face turned bright red. The judge, clearly tired of her antics, didn't even let her respond. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm warning you, any further attempts to harass Mr. Reynolds will be met with severe consequences. The courtroom erupted in applause as the judge dismissed the case. Jack turned to Samantha, shaking her hand. You're a lifesaver. Samantha grinned. Just doing my job. As they left the courthouse, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. Sure, Karen would probably try something else eventually. People like her always did. But for now, the battle was won. And if she did come back, well, Jack was more than ready for round 3. In the weeks that followed, the tension surrounding Jack's farm began to ease. The court victory had been decisive, and with Greg's arrest and the judge's stern warning, it seemed that the HOA had finally been put in its place. For the first time in months, Jack could breathe easy. He walked his fields with a lightness in his step, savoring the calm that had returned to his life. But what Jack didn't expect was how much support he'd continue to receive from the community. People stopped by almost daily to check on him, offering help, stories about their own home nightmares, and thanking him for standing up to Karen. It turned out that Jack had become a bit of a local hero. His farm had become a symbol of resistance against overreaching authority, and folks admired his grit and determination. To celebrate the victory, Jack decided to throw a big farm party and invite everyone in the town. It was the least he could do to thank the people who had stood by him during the worst of it. The preparations started early, with neighbors helping to string up lights, set up tables, and bring enough food to feed an army. The evening of the party, the farm was buzzing with life. Music played from speakers set up near the barn. Kids ran around chasing chickens, and adults mingled with plates full of barbecue and homemade pies. Jack stood in the middle of it all, soaking in the scene with a smile. Sheriff Daniels raised a glass to Jack Reynolds, the man who proved you don't mess with a farmer. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Jack gave a modest wave. "Thank you all," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I couldn't have done this without you. This farm's been in my family for generations, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA take it away. You stood by me, and that means more than I can say." As the party continued, there was laughter, dancing, and plenty of joking about HOA rules. One neighbor even made a mock sign that read, "HOA free zone, no Karen allowed." It got a good laugh from the crowd. Even Jack couldn't help but chuckle. But not everyone was laughing. Standing at the edge of the party, unnoticed at first, was Karen. She wasn't her usual smug self. Her shoulders were slumped, and she looked more defeated than anyone had ever seen her. Jack noticed her, and despite the truth that Karen had made his life a nightmare, he didn't take pleasure in seeing her like that. He walked over to her. "Didn't think I'd see you here," he said. Karen gave a weak smile. "I thought about staying away, but I wanted to apologize." Jack crossed his arms. "Apologize?" She nodded. "I've been awful. I got so caught up in trying to control everything that I forgot what really matters. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, but I was just being a bully. I'm sorry, Jack." Jack studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It takes guts to admit you were wrong." He glanced toward the party. "You hungry? We've got plenty of food." Karen hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." They walked back toward the party together, and for the first time, Karen seemed human. She wasn't the HOA tyrant anymore. She was just someone who had made a lot of mistakes and was trying to make amends. The rest of the night passed without incident. Karen even helped clean up afterward, much to the shock of everyone else. Some weren't ready to forgive her yet, but Jack figured everyone deserved a second chance, even Karen. In the days that followed, Karen kept her word. She resigned as president of the HOA and took a step back from neighborhood affairs. Good affairs. She started volunteering at the local community center, focusing on more constructive ways to help others. Slowly but surely, she began to rebuild her reputation. Jack, meanwhile, got back to what he did best. Farming life returned to normal, but with one important difference. He knew he had an entire community behind him now. No matter what happened next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. One afternoon, as Jack was repairing a fence, Sheriff Daniels pulled up in his patrol car. He leaned out the window, a grin on his face. "So, Jack, you think you've seen the last of the HOA drama?" Jack laughed, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Honestly, probably not. But if it comes back, I'll be ready." The sheriff chuckled. "I'm sure you will." As the sheriff drove off, Jack looked out over his fields, the golden sunlight washing over the crops. It had been a long, hard fight, but it was worth it. His farm was still standing, stronger than ever, and so was he. He gave a satisfied nod and got back to work. After all, there was always more to do on the farm. Life went on, and Jack wouldn't have it any other way. And if Karen or anyone else ever tried to mess with him again, well, they'd quickly learn the same lesson the HOA had. You don't mess with a farmer.